Hello and welcome to the show that has no name. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and I've got 4 days off in between jobs after quitting one job working at a sheet metal shop and starting another job at a different sheet metal shop. I've got some time off, so I'm just kind of hanging out and making a few extra videos. And running around is my dog Genghis. So maybe you'll get to see Genghis, which is good because he's a good dog to see. He's really a majestic beast. And he's somewhat on the autism spectrum, but still, he's a magnificent dog. And I hope he makes an appearance before this thing is over. So, what I'm going to talk about in this little episode of the show that has no name is I've been asked a number of times about like paranormal experiences in my life. You know, what kind of paranormal experiences have I experienced? And it's kind of ironic, I suppose, that very few of them were while I was a monk. Relatively few. Mostly they were when I was a layperson, and they're still happening. You know, before I became a monk, I had certain, probably the most spectacular paranormal experience I've had was before I became a monk. Then relatively few while I was a monk, and then afterwards, there's also some. I, I don't know if you'd even call it paranormal or not, just some really strange synchronicity keeps happening. And that happened today also. So, um, so we'll get to that. But first, I suppose I just start when I was a kid. And the main paranormal experience I had as a child was I was able to see a ghost when I was very small. We lived in a house where uh, the former owner. Oh, wait just a second. Genghis. Genghis, come here, buddy. I'd like to introduce you to my dog, Genghis. Right here. Here, say hi to everyone, Genghis. He's waving. There you go. There you go. So where was I? Oh yeah, he's coming back for more. When I was a kid, I apparently could see a ghost, and that was the the former owner of the house we moved into when I was very small. Was an old lady who had died in the house, and apparently I could see her. I still very vaguely remember her, although it was occurring right around the time when your long-term memory is just starting to get hooked up. So I can just remember a few things. I mean, she was an old lady who wore like this a dress. I vaguely remember sort of a white dress with like a blue flower print on it. She never spoke, but she smiled at me. I had this one dream when I was a little kid of her leading me into the attic and showing me something. I think it was a box of puppies or something, but that was just a dream. And my father, I mean, he could see ghosts. He really believed in that kind of stuff, and so he was asking the neighbors, you know, what the old lady looked like, and kind of comparing with my descriptions of her, and so he was satisfied that I really could see this little old lady. But my father was really a more liminal person than I am. And if you don't know what the word liminal means, I picked up the term. It became part of my working vocabulary after reading a book called The Trickster and the Paranormal by George P. Hansen, which I highly recommend. It's really kind of it's one of those books that just fills in this big gap in your knowledge, and it kind of helps to integrate things and helps you to see things in a different way, um, like significantly change your worldview. And according to him, paranormal events especially occur around liminal people. And a liminal person is a person who isn't completely following the rules of this world. Um, he points out that a lot of psychics, for example, they're deviants in certain ways. Like, for example, sexual deviations. Like they may be homosexual or bisexual. And I'm not saying that deviant is necessarily a bad term. It's just deviating from the natural course of things. He also, I think he points out in the book that witches, for example, have increased their liminality and thus their capacity for paranormal powers, psychic powers, magic, through deliberately violating norms. just sexual orgies and that sort of thing. So I'm relatively liminal. I do think that my rationality is sort of has like a dampening effect on my liminality. If I was less rational, I might be more liminal, but I'm just guessing. My father was more liminal than I am, and he practiced witchcraft like experimentally. He wasn't like a Wicca witch or anything. That he just read a lot of books and had a lot of experiences that sort of guided his approach, and he became the leader of a coven of bored housewife witches. Um, I didn't really have much experience with that. When I was a kid, there's one experience I had that wasn't directly paranormal, but it was indirectly paranormal because my father had recorded a seance that he and my mother went to, and there were two spirits, two voices that came through this woman in trance. It was kind of creepy listening to it as a kid, partly because the woman is like breathing heavily throughout the whole thing. And the first part of the seance, it was just, oh, she was speaking apparently in a foreign language. It sounded like some kind of American, like American Indian language, just Native American language, but nobody could understand it. I mean, it didn't sound like she was just babbling. It did seem like there was like a kind of rhythm and grammar to it, but who knows? Nobody could understand. And it took some doing for them to kind of get rid of this one. And then after that, there was just the medium, I guess the channeler, they would be called nowadays, unless there's a newer language, a newer word for it. Um, she just began this booming laughter and then turned to my mother and asked, "Do you remember me?" And it turned out that it was this old lady, this old black lady that lived, it was a neighbor of my mother when she was a little girl. And nobody else in the room knew who she was, but she was called Auntie. And she had like a conversation with my mother. So that was kind of indirectly paranormal experience, but I guess the most spectacular paranormal experience I have had in my life was we were hiring a housekeeper. I've probably told this story before. Those of you who read my stuff and watch my videos are probably familiar with the story. But I was about 12 years old at the time, 13 maybe, and we had a poltergeist in our house. Like dishes in the cupboards would spontaneously break. Silverware would come out of the dishwasher all bent and warped, or they'd be bent and warped in the drawers. And so my father was hiring a housekeeper for the summer, and he told her, I mean, I remember fairly clearly, my father was sitting at one end of the table. The new housekeeper was sitting like right around the corner of the table from him. I was sitting at the other end, and there was an ashtray sitting right in between my father and the new housekeeper. And I think it had maybe one lit cigarette in it. And he was telling her that if you find anything broken around the house, like broken dishes, don't immediately blame the kids because there's a poltergeist in the house and things spontaneously break. And while he's explaining this to her, it's like one of her eyebrows is slowly going up, like, and she's starting to get kind of a grin on her face, like she can't decide whether he's joking or crazy. And then right when he finished his explanation of the poltergeist in the house, that glass ashtray right in between them made a sound like zink and just split into two halves, which slid about an inch and a half away from each other. And she just immediately stopped grinning and started taking him seriously. And I just realized that I forgot a beverage. I mean, I'm not going to turn off the video or anything. Well, yes, I am. What the hell? I'm turning off the video and getting my beverage. Okay, I'm back, and I got the beverage. I've never drank this before, but because I'm in the South, I've always wanted to try this. Cheer wine. And I'm probably just going to drink it this one time in my entire life because it's got corn syrup in it, and I'm really not into corn syrup. I think more people in the South drink Mountain Dew, but I'm just not into Mountain Dew. Yeah, it's sort of like Mr. Pibb. If any of you drink that? But this is not a beverage mukbang. So, set it down. And where was I? Oh yeah, I was talking about the ashtray splitting. Um, I've read parapsychology books, and they tend to be of the opinion, the parapsychologists I mean, that poltergeist phenomena really aren't a ghost, like a disembodied spirit, but it's usually, I think it's called RSPK, or recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, centered around an emotionally troubled adolescent. And I really don't think that I was the emotionally troubled adolescent. I don't think I was all that emotionally troubled when I was young. It's possible, but it could have been my brother, who was 4 years younger than me, who had been like 8 or 9 years old at the time, but I'm not sure about that either. Or it could have been my father, who maybe was kind of still adolescent in certain ways, even though he was 42 years old when he had me. My father was kind of the opinion that it really was a spirit, and my brother, when he was small, could see this person that he called the man, and it was a black man, and my father had him identified as Uncle Henry, who was a servant to, I think, my great-grandfather or my great-great-grandfather. He was a freed slave who stayed with his former owner, and they were best friends. And he was sort of a member of the family, and my father believed that it was him, but who knows. The only other paranormal event that I can really remember as a layperson before I became a monk was I once had a deja vu before the thing happened, so that I knew what was going to happen. It was like precognition. And it was something completely mundane. I'm sitting in this room of people. I was just this long-haired, semi-hippie at the time. And I just knew that someone in that room was going to say that you can't cook a turkey in a microwave. And I was just sitting there grinning like an ape, waiting for them to say it, because I knew someone was going to say it, and sure enough, they said it. With regard to liminal experiences or paranormal experiences of this sort, I don't think there really is much of an explanation, because according to that book that I was talking about, The Trickster and the Paranormal events, psychic events, they tend to just slip through the cracks, creating the order of whatever world a person is living in, a being, I should say. And so it's sort of an anarchistic thing that isn't following rules when it happens. It just kind of slips through the cracks between the rules. So that was about it. There's one kind of paranormal event. I don't even know if you can call it paranormal. I've been intending to write about this. Maybe I'll write a blog post about it tomorrow. But there have been times in my life when I have been near death. As a layperson, it was usually driving way too fast and hitting a patch of ice and just starting to skid or spin out of control. And when that would happen, my thinking mind would just stop. I'd be in this state of crystal silent clarity, and my body would just do whatever was required to keep me alive. And only after the danger was past, I would start thinking again and re-enter an ordinary, normal frame of mind with, thinking and all that. And it is as though some kind of higher power is just taking control of your body. And I would say that from my own experience, that would be as close to an example of a soul as possible, just like a higher level of your consciousness that you're not you're not consciously aware of it, but it's always there. And it wouldn't go against Buddhism so much, because it's not ultimately real. It's conditioned and just part of Maya, just like anything else. So it's like a higher level of your mentality or whatever. But ultimately it's no more real than this cheer wine is. So I'll just have another drink. But when I was a monk, it happened to me once. It was kind of a strange situation where I was living at the edge of a national park, Alondo Kaltapa National Park in northwestern Burma. And I was living in this box canyon. And sometimes I'd be sitting there under the rock ledge looking up at the edge of the box canyon. They had like these steep walls, and just wondering what was up there. And I figured it was just too steep. It'd be too much trouble. It's the weather's hot. You don't want to just knock yourself out in the blazing tropical heat. And then one night there was a forest fire, because people would just light the underbrush on fire, or just the leaves and other debris on the ground, to attract fish into their nets at night. These minnows that they would be catching were attracted to light. They'd swim towards it and get caught in the net. I think that's the main reason. Other than maybe some slash and burn out in the national park, which was, I had one of the villagers tell me it's just called a wildlife refuge, because that's essentially what it was. Poaching was one of the economic mainstays of that village. But anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, there was this forest fire. It wasn't the tops of the trees on fire, but it was like just all the underbrush, all the dry grass and leaves and everything was burning, and there was like burning stuff like falling down into my box canyon. I didn't want my box canyon to go up in flames. So even though it was too steep for me to climb this thing during the day, all of a sudden in the middle of the night, wearing monk's robes, barefoot, I'm climbing up the side of this hill armed with nothing but a lit candle, because I didn't have a flashlight, and a bamboo pole to fight the fire. And so I get up there well enough, and I'm able to put the fire out, just sort of making a little fire lane around the burning leaves and so forth with the stick, or hitting the fire out. And so that was no problem. But then coming back down again, that was a whole different thing, because the fire was lighting my way on my way up, and it was very steep. It was like this, so that when you're going up, your face is like right there, you can see the ground. But when you're going back down again, your face is way up here, and the ground that you're stepping on is way down in front of you. And all I had was this one candle, and of course my feet just shot out from under me. I stepped in some dry leaves or something, and I'm just tobogganing down my back down this slope, and there was drop-offs. You had to navigate your way up, and it went straight down in certain places. And it was the same thing happened. It was, my mind just goes completely silent, not blank, but just crystal clear and silent. I'm not thinking, and I just did whatever was necessary to keep me alive. One of the first things I did was just go spread eagle to increase like the drag, to slow down my toboggan ride on my back down this steep slope. And I let go of the bamboo pole immediately, but for some reason, you don't even have time to think about this, I kept a firm grip on that candle, because if I had dropped the candle, I would have been on that hillside until morning. And I did have a lighter tucked up in my lower robe so that I could relight it if necessary. So I'm just like grabbing at vines with my free hand that isn't holding the candle, and they're all snapping. Maybe they slowed me down a little bit, and finally I came to a rest, 1 foot up against a clump of bamboo growing out of the side of the hill, and the other one just literally hanging off this vertical drop off. And so again, it was like this higher power, it would seem, or it's just this latent consciousness that you've always got, probably, that's always there, that usually isn't getting involved in the mundane affairs of your life, that sometimes just has to keep you alive. And I remember talking about this just, I guess it was just last weekend, to some people on the Discord server, and one of them, who had been in the military, he said definitely, that had happened to him a number of times when he was fighting in Afghanistan or Iraq, I can't remember which, where, you're in a life or death situation. Your life is in peril. It's this crystal clarity, this mental silence, and this seeming higher power, higher than the mundane ego anyway, is just taking control, doing what is required to keep you alive, and then doesn't let go until the danger is past. And so that's happened to me a number of times in my life. Mostly, as I say, when I was a layperson and like skidding out of control in a car or some such. But with regard, but as a monk, I mean, that was about as paranormal as it got. It's kind of ironic. I mean, I was warned about like I'd be living in forests a lot, and friends of mine, like I had this one friend who was he had a degree in he had a degree in physics, and he was a high school mathematics teacher before he became a monk. So he was an intelligent person, you know, well above average in intelligence, and you know had a more or less Western education, spoke English fairly well, and he'd warned me in all seriousness that if you live here in this forest, it was the forest I was living in was the Beain Forest Monastery in southern Burma, and he's saying you got to be careful because there's an assault, which is a kind of like a terrestrial, like a low-level terrestrial deity that guards a certain area. You know, you got to be careful about spitting on the ground or peeing on the ground in certain areas, that kind of a thing. There was some kind of dragon that lived there, and also there was an entire little army of ogres or yaka who were armed with a kind of supernatural guns that if they shot you with it, you'd go insane. And there was this story, well-known story in the area about some kind of Hindu Swami who lived in that same forest where I had lived, or where I was about to live at the time. And he knew about the ogres, and he made the terrible mistake of trying to make an enchanted circle around him for protection. You know, so long as he was inside this circle, the ogres couldn't get him. But all it did was piss off the ogres, according to the story, because I guess Yaka ogres are territorial. So he's like marking off his own territory on their turf. They didn't stand for it, and so they attacked him with the supernatural guns, and he went into like a fugue state. He just was like lost his mind, and he's just wandering around lost in the forest until finally he comes out onto a highway, still with like amnesia, not knowing who he was or where he was. And some people took him in, and after he had sufficiently recovered, he went back to India or wherever it was that he came from. And I remember it was during Thinjan in Thailand. It's Songkran. It's Indian New Year's, and in Thailand and Burma they follow the Indian reckoning of the beginning and the end of the year, because the classical culture that Burma and Thailand look to for the roots of their culture, or at least the classical roots of their culture, is India. You know, we look towards Rome especially, but in Burma and Thailand they look to India for their classical culture. And where was I? Oh yeah, it was during the Indian New Year and the Burmese New Year. And I mean, I shouldn't go into the whole story. I've told this story more than once too. But what happened was, I was just waking up, and didn't have a clock, didn't have a watch, so I went by dawn. When it was dawn, I'd leave for alms, because that's the only time you really had to know what time it was anyway. And so I'm propped up. I'm lying on my side, propped up like this, looking for any sign of the sun starting to come up. And I start hearing this loud, I mean, it sounded like a bass guitar being thrummed over a loudspeaker system down the valley, like boing, boing. And I'm thinking, wow, what is that? And then I start hearing like a multitude of voices, but they're all obviously coming from inside my own head. It sounded sort of like towards the end of, I think it's the song Welcome to the Machine by Pink Floyd on their album Wish You Were Here. You know, it's just all these voices talking simultaneously, sort of like a crowd talking. It was like that. And I mean, I knew it was inside my head. And then all of a sudden I realized that I was completely paralyzed. I could not move my body. So I was just stuck like this, kind of looking in a certain direction. And at the time I thought, well, should I be scared? But I mean, being scared wasn't going to help anything. So I thought, well, just on the off chance this is some kind of Buddhist beings, then I mean, so long as, you know, they're accepting Buddhism as true, sort of like demons in Western culture would have to accept Christianity as true, you know, in the name of Jesus, you know, it would have power. So I just started kind of reciting in my mind, um, Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sammasambuddhassa. And it just immediately, everything poofed and I was fine. But I wouldn't consider that to be necessarily paranormal because, as I said, I had just woken up, and there is such a thing as sleep paralysis, where it's a natural mechanism in your body that it prevents you from acting out your dreams. You're paralyzed when you're dreaming. Otherwise, you're going to be talking and moving your arms around and maybe sleepwalking and so forth. So that one I wouldn't necessarily call paranormal, but there's a lot of warnings about, supernatural entities and witches and so forth in Burma. Like one place I lived at, I was warned about. Um, there was I lived kind of on one side of a river on a hill, and then there was two hills on the other side, both of them extinct volcanoes. And one of the smaller of the two hills on the other side supposedly had this witch living there, and she had already made one monk at that monastery go insane. And so I was warned, just don't mess with any witches, if any, just don't insult them or anything like that. But again, that's just being told about something that didn't personally directly happen to me. I mean, there's lots of weird stories about witches. Like, there's this one story that was told to me by one of my teachers. He was a senior monk, serious guy. He wasn't lying to me. And I mean, but again, it's like secondhand knowledge even to him. He wasn't there. But apparently, the daughter of a certain witch falls in love with this guy. The guy prefers somebody else. He's just not interested. So the witch's daughter goes home to her witch mama boo-hooing. The witch mama puts a hex on this guy, and he starts having really intense abdominal pains. So eventually he goes to the doctor, they x-ray him, and they find he's got a wooden shoe in his stomach. I mean, it was too big for him to swallow. So they immediately they don't know how it happened, but it was bad enough. They had to cut him open, take the shoe out. They sew him back up. He's lying on the hospital bed, recovering. And then all of a sudden he starts having these really severe abdominal pains again. They x-ray him again. He's got another shoe in his stomach. And then they know that this is magic. Mere doctors cannot cure this sort of thing. So they called in an Apolancia. And an Apolancia is like a white wizard. It's like he's like a good Buddhist wizard who uses, in the name of Buddha kind of stuff, and just Buddhist chanting and this sort of thing as a way of curing people. And at first, I mean, his mere touch on this guy's arm would have the guy screaming in pain, but eventually he was able to cure him, and the wooden shoes stayed out of his stomach after that. But again, I heard of a few senior monks that had a reputation for mind reading. I met one, although I'm not aware of him reading my mind. That was Shui Umin Seattle. Yeah, I mean, he was about 90 years old at the time, but he was just sharp as a tack. I mean, he was just clear, just looking right through you. And he was like fully there, unlike a lot of 90-year-olds, including another old monk that was with him. And the other old monk that was with him, I mean, people had to like shout into his ear and in order to get any kind of communication going. And even then, it was like a coin toss whether or not he'd understand. But Shui Umin Seattle, I mean, he was just 100% right there. And I knew one of his disciples who said that he had read his mind more than once. Also, there was some monk in Thailand. I had a German monk tell me, if you have any doubts that sort of thing exists, go meet this monk in Thailand, and he reads minds and doesn't make any secret of it. Weibu Seattle, who died back in the late 70s, I guess, who had a reputation for being an arahant in Burma. He also had psychic powers, allegedly. I never met him. And so, I mean, I really didn't have a whole lot of paranormal experiences as a monk. I saw an apparition once, but just because you see an apparition doesn't necessarily mean that there's some kind of supernatural entity there. I was living at the same monastery, the same cave on the hill that had the witch living on the other side of the river. And I was walking. I just taken my evening bath and had a 5-gallon bucket of water on my shoulder like this, walking towards the hill where my cave was up near the top. And I see a young guy in a blue shirt come out of the forest, and as soon as he sees me, he just takes off like a shot, sort of laterally to me, kind of sideways, and runs behind the congregation hall. And I mean, I was mainly looking down. I saw him mainly with my peripheral vision, because when you go barefoot and you're walking in the tropics, you have to be looking down pretty much all the time to make sure you don't step on like an ant highway or a scorpion or a snake or something like that. So I'm kind of looking down, and with my peripheral vision, I could see him well enough to know that he was a young guy with a blue shirt, just average height for a Burmese guy, just medium brown color like the average Burmese guy. And I started thinking, well, I mean, if a monk sees somebody at a monastery and the person just immediately runs as soon as he sees the monk, he must be a thief. So then I'm looking for him. I can't find him anywhere. It's like, and then I'm thinking, like, he ran so fast and it was completely silent. There was no thudding of feet on the ground as he's running like 20 feet away from me. I mean, it was just completely silent, and he was like a streak. He ran really fast, and then there's no sign of him, no footprints, anything. So, I mean, maybe that was an apparition. I mean, I wasn't sleep deprived. I was fully healthy. I mean, I wasn't on drugs or anything, and that sort of thing had never happened to me before. My collar keeps bending up on that side. So, I mean, maybe. But that sort of thing you really can't prove. But then again, according to the theory, psychic phenomena as a general rule are not things that you can prove empirically. Every once in a while, like you've got parapsychology labs where people are consistently guessing cards above random average to a significant degree. It might just be like, a fraction of 1% of the time that but still, if you do 1,000 tests, that's a large enough sample size that it really is significant. So, like in the Soviet Union, they had this woman, Nina Kulagina, I think was her name, who, there's films of her just like moving things. She was like Uri Geller, I guess, who could move things like enclosed in glass cases so that, I mean, she couldn't touch them or anything. And there actually was, back during the Cold War, a kind of psychic arms race going on where the Soviets and the Americans and the Chinese too were intensively studying psychic phenomena, trying to come up with like a mind bomb or some kind of psychic James Bond who would fight for them or something. But again, psychic stuff, paranormal stuff, doesn't follow rules, and so it's not consistent enough. You can't do it consistently, and so there is that. But then, after I became a monk, which is relatively recent, I just dropped out of the monkhood like a little over 2 years ago, that I've got certain connections, and this has happened to some degree before, but my sweetheart and I have some kind of psychic connection that is, I'm pretty sure, paranormal, because, I mean, it's mainly me saying stuff that has her mouth falling open because she's thinking exactly the same thing, or a lot of things just like bodily marks. Just even today, I mentioned that this sort of synchronicity, at the very least, happened today where I was investigating like this brown spot on my leg, and then she was showing me on her leg in the exact same place, she's got the same kind of brown spot right there. It's the only brown spot either one of us has on our body, is the exact same place. And that sort of thing happens a lot. We've got a birthmark on the same place. One time she got like a little wart on her finger, and neither of us gets warts often at all, but she's saying, I think I got a wart right here. And I'm like, oh, you mean like this one? It was exactly the same place on my finger. Of course she thinks that's weird, but I think my favorite of all time was I was at work, and just at the spur of the moment, for no good reason whatsoever, I texted my sweetheart with a text that said something like, "I huff your cleavage." And she texted back to me saying, "All right, psychic boy," because as it turned out, at the exact moment that I was texting her, she was checking to see if her deodorant was still working by like going like this with her blouse and sniffing. So she was huffing her own cleavage essentially at the exact moment that I texted her, "I huff your cleavage." And this sort of thing happens at least once a week. Pretty much every few days, it seems like this sort of thing is happening between us, which suggests to me that we've got like some kind of connection deeper down, which shouldn't surprise anybody, because I mean, people in general have this kind of awareness. Like, they've done studies showing that people tend to have like this sixth sense with regard to knowing when somebody is staring at them. You know, they've done scientific studies on this where people are able to know well above like random guessing when somebody is like behind them looking directly at them. And animals can do this too. My father used to tell me that hunting moose can be very difficult. He lived in Alaska. I was born in Alaska. And he said that trying to sneak up on a moose, if you're moose hunting, is almost impossible, because they always get spooked. They always sense your presence and take off. But if you sneak up on a tree right next to the moose, it's as easy as shooting cows. And there is a theory that, I think it was Gary, what was his name? He was one of the leaders of the beatnik movement, Gary Snyder. He had this theory, I think it might be correct, that that's how meditation was originally invented in the Stone Age. It was through like hunting magic, where people, Stone Age hunters, believed that animals can like hear your thoughts, and so they would be sitting in ambush by the side of a game trail, just not thinking, being wide awake. I mean, they wouldn't go to sleep or anything, because then the animal walks right by and they don't notice. But you're just sitting there, wide awake, not thinking. You got a silent mind. And it's probably easier in the Stone Age, back when people didn't have all that much to think about. Now, Westerners were just compulsive thinkers. But I've found, like in Burma, like a simple subsistence farmer living in a village in rural Burma, he really doesn't think all that much, and they can go into relatively deep meditative states fairly easily, unlike us. So, yeah, I guess that's it. That's like the extent of my paranormal experiences that I know of since I became a monk. Really are like this deep, weird psychic connection I have with my sweetheart. And as for cheerwine, I don't know, it's kind of like Dr. Pepper or something. This probably, I mean, it's not bad, but this probably will be my last cheerwine. So this is a historic video, as you'll never see me drink cheerwine ever again. And I mean, I'm still racking my brains trying to come up with something other than what I've experienced, but I've never really had much psychic talent, and I think to some degree my rationality, what rationality I've got, does have like a dampening effect on psychic phenomena in my life. I've been exposed to some very liminal people who have a lot more psychic experience than me, including my father, of course. When I was a kid, instead of watching TV before going to bed, sometimes I'd be sitting on his lap and he'd be telling me about astral traveling and ghost stories and this sort of thing. So I do believe definitely that the so-called laws of physics can be broken, and that there is essentially anything is possible. Not only anything that can be imagined, but a lot of stuff that can't be imagined is possible. And so that's my little video sitting in the yard. I'm glad you all got to see Genghis, and I'll be starting my new job in 2 days, and we'll find out how that goes, and be happy.